Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. Molly's two sisters have been a fact of my life practically since our very first date. I had never met identical triplets before, and it was both disturbing and very cool to see three similar to each other, or rather three gorgeous similar to each other, when I went to pick up Molly at her apartment. We met at the grocery store when she asked me to reach the top shelf for herbal tea, which she couldn't get to. Molly is only 157 centimeters tall, curvaceous and voluptuous, with blue-black hair that she wears short around her ears. I'm a little over 183 centimeters tall, so I was the natural person she turned to for help. It wasn't until the fourth date that I found out that she saw me in the grocery department, thought I was cute, and waited patiently by the herbal tea until I came over to ask for help. It was very flattering, I tell you. Even better, when she told me about it, she was lying naked in my arms, and we had just finished making love for the first time. Our first couple of dates were just wonderful. We went to dinner and talked until almost 11 p.m. We walked through the park and fed the ducks. We went to a pretty shabby girly movie and held hands throughout the movie. It's pretty corny, isn't it? But I was smitten, fascinated, bewitched. Molly was the most beautiful girl I've ever met, a beautiful, in a good way, girl from next door, with a smile that could melt the heart of an IRS auditor. After I got her tea, she chatted amiably with me, letting me think I was filming her. And I was absolutely thrilled when I headed to the checkout, with a date scheduled for next Friday. She said something vague about having sisters, but I wasn't ready to meet three beautiful Mollys when one of them opened the door and said, "Hi, you must be Scott." My tongue was slurring. "And not Molly?" She laughed as charmingly as Molly had during our conversation at the grocery store and said, "No, I'm Hannah. Molly, Amy and I are triplets. Didn't she mention us?" Yes, she probably mentioned it, but for some reason I haven't heard anything about the twins. Hannah laughed again. "Molly does that sometimes, just having a little fun at your expense. I'll go get her. Come in." There was another Molly in the living room, but of course it was Amy. They all had the same haircuts, the same figures, and the same dazzling smiles, so I didn't have a chance to find out who was who until Molly came out of one of the bedrooms and said, "Hi, Scott. Would you like a nice cup of herbal tea?" During the first dinner, we talked about everything in the world, but we devoted a lot of time to Molly's life as triplets. I was fascinated and wanted to know everything about how it was. Does she like to constantly see herself in two other faces? Were they closer than most siblings? Could they almost read each other's minds, as identical twins should be able to do? Have they ever changed their identities to deceive people? "I do not know if we read each other's minds," Molly told me, "but we are very close. It seems to me that I can almost always tell what Amy or Hannah is thinking, and they often do the same thing. For example, they answer a question that I haven't had time to ask yet. We've always been like this. As for deceiving other people," she stopped and smiled at me. "I think we've been doing this kind of thing for a while. Have you noticed that we all wear the same hairstyles?" I nodded, and she continued. "As little girls, we loved to fool people, our elementary school teachers, relatives, even parents. They couldn't tell us apart either, surprisingly enough. It was a lot of fun, especially when Amy or Hannah got into trouble and wanted to avoid being spanked. 'No, Dad, I'm not Amy, I'm Molly,' she grinned. You can imagine how it happened. Mom and Dad must have been going crazy. Then in high school, we all wanted to be different. For a while, we were very annoyed that people were constantly confusing us. That's why we wore different hairstyles, went to different classes, and engaged in different activities. For example, I was on the staff of the yearbook. Amy was writing for the newspaper, and Hannah was playing field hockey. But after a few years, we began to lack interchangeability, so we returned to the external similarity. From time to time, I would take the chemistry test for Amy, or Hannah would do the oral presentation for me. It helped us all a little with the grades, you know? She chuckled. And there was one time when Brad Hendricks asked Amy out in our junior year. She was crazy about him, and when she got the flu on the morning of their date, she was beside herself. She cried and moaned, saying that he would never ask her out on a date again if she canceled it. In the end, she talked me into being her for one night. It wasn't difficult because it was their first date and they didn't know each other very well anyway. Starting with date #2, Amy took over again, and they dated for almost a year. She never told him that I was her understudy. Years later, of course, I remembered this story with a great deal of bitterness. But as I said, at that time I was sitting at the table opposite a beautiful, cheerful, charming girl. I was already crazy about her, and the fact that she seemed to like me too was incredible, like a miracle. 3 girls left for college and they liked to live separately, but they also missed each other, so after graduating from college, all 3 moved back to Cincinnati. They found a large shared apartment, and that's where I went to pick up Molly on our date, where I first met her sisters. So we can fast forward 8 years. Molly and I dated, fell in love, and got married 2 years later. I considered myself the happiest person on planet Earth. I had a job at a graphic design firm, and because I had more computer experience than the older guys who ran the place, I was a valuable commodity, so I made good money. We could easily afford a nice 3-bedroom house in Oakley Square, just a few miles from our downtown job, and I think you won't be surprised to find out who our neighbors were. 3 years after Molly and I got married, Amy married a tall, rather boring guy named Ted, who worked in the financial sector. He was quite friendly, just not very interesting. Anyway, they lived next to us, at the end of a small dead-end street called Ferdinand Place. Amy and Ted's yard overlooked the backyard of the house on Oak Park Place. And guess who lived there? Sorry, you won't get points because it was too easy. Hannah, of course, is with her husband Arnold. Arnie was the exact opposite of Ted. He was a few years older than us, a short, cheerful guy who owned several bowling alleys in the Cincinnati area. He smoked cigars until Hannah forced him to quit, told funny, often obscene jokes, and was amazing company. They got married a few months before Amy and Ted. It was no surprise to any of the 3 husbands that our wives insisted on living so close to each other. They were almost like Siamese triplets, joined by hips. Ted, Arnie, and I were used to them finishing each other's sentences or seeming to express the same thoughts at the same time. We also got used to their need to get together every night, practically every night, to chat before going to bed. They met in one of our 3 kitchens, around 21:30 or 22, talked for a while, and then each went home to her husband. Even after 8 years of living with Molly, I could never say for sure which of them were triplets, and Ted and Arnie admitted that they had the same problem. We have all learned very well to notice what kind of clothes each wife is wearing, or who is wearing this or that necklace or earrings. When we spent Christmas with Pam and Donald, their parents, it became clear that it was just as difficult for them to distinguish between their daughters as it was for us. This does not mean that their characters were the same. Amy was a little stiff, a little more prim and conservative than her 2 sisters. Hannah, on the other hand, was wild. She drank a little more, told more vulgar jokes, and would certainly be considered the most likely topless dancer in a bar of the 3 sisters, although I don't think she ever did. My Molly was between them, and I thought she was perfect, nicer and more sociable than Amy, but more balanced than Hannah. So it's not that you didn't notice the differences between the sisters when we were all spending time together. Rather, it was because you couldn't tell by eye or voice which one was which. In another way, it can be said this way. When they wanted to cheat you, you didn't have a chance. Since none of us had children yet, it was easy to plan a vacation. As you may have guessed, Molly and her sisters demanded that we rest together, the 6 of us. So every summer we would take 2 weeks and go somewhere interesting. Las Vegas, or a beach resort in North Carolina, or Italy in 1 year. We were a pretty compatible group, so the husbands didn't mind. But in return, I insisted on going away with Molly for a week every year. Just the 2 of us, without Amy, without Hannah, without brothers-in-law. At first, it was a real point of contention, and there were several heated arguments and icy silences. It took several times before Molly realized that I was completely serious. In fact, it took 3 years before everything fell into place. I love your sisters, and I have fun with Arnie and Ted, but I want to have time just for us. Is it really that hard to understand? This is my deal. You get a 2-week trip with all of us every year, and I get 1 week alone with you. I've probably given this speech a dozen times, but it wasn't until the day before the trip to Italy, when Molly came home from work and saw that I hadn't even started packing, that she gave up. That was an argument, but I firmly said that if she did not agree to spend a week with me, I would stay at home. She and 2 other couples can go to Italy without me. It took more than an hour of screaming and all this without my participation, and about 20 phone calls to Amy and Hannah. Both sisters came to help Molly calm me down, but I didn't give in. They were happy to explain to me over and over again how selfish and short-sighted I was, and that no loving husband would be so adamant, etc. In the end, Molly agreed to my demand and we went to Italy. But it was pretty cold between us for a few days, and her sisters joined her to make sure I knew I was in the kennel. If it hadn't been for the support of Arnie and Ted, who secretly rejoiced at my victory, since it meant that they would receive the same offers from their wives, I could have given up and flown home early. But by about the 5th day, the romance and beauty of Florence had softened Molly, and the rest of the trip was amazing, just like our week on Sanibel Island next winter. After that, every year we spent 2 wonderful weeks with Molly's sisters, and 1 wonderful week without them. So what's the problem? It all sounds amazing, right? And so it was. The problem arose when we started trying to have children. Molly and I knew we'd have them someday, but we were enjoying life too much as a couple, or as a couple glued to 2 other couples, to rush it. But when she and her sisters turned 30, I was 32, the biological clock began to strike. She stopped taking the pills, and after a couple of months, Molly and I started creating a baby. I did not object either to the goal or to the process of achieving it. I have always loved love with my beautiful, delightful wife. Our life, more often than not, was intimate and tender, not rough and wild. We had 3 or 4 favorite positions, and the nights when we spent extra time being playful or inventive became less and less frequent over the years, as I think happens with most married couples. Oral love was almost always a part of our lovemaking, as Molly really liked the way I made her cunnilingus. From time to time, Molly surprised me. She came to bed very excited and was much more aggressive, and we made love several times a night. On a birthday or anniversary, we always drank champagne, and it invariably turned her on even more. But mostly everything was more gentle and loving, and that suited me. One night after she had just raped me, I joked with her about it and found that I didn't like it at all. It was Saturday, and when I returned from the grocery store with groceries for dinner, I heard her calling me from the bedroom, where I found her lying naked on her stomach on the bed, with a bottle of massage oil. "I'm a little tense today, cowboy," she murmured. "Do you think you could help me? It was amazing." I worked her back and legs carefully while she moaned contentedly, then turned her over and began to work on her, first with my fingers, and then much longer with my lips and tongue until she finished the job 3 times. Then we made love, hard, until I brought it to her in ecstasy. For a while, we lay dreamily together. Molly went to the kitchen and brought us a snack dinner seemed to have been taken off the agenda, and soon we started tumbling again. She gave me the highest level of pleasure by stopping just before I finished the job, and then she rode me like a wild woman. When we took a deep breath, smiling at each other, I said, "Wow, that was something, Molly." Then I pretended to think hard. Or wait, maybe you're not Molly. Maybe I just got really lucky with Amy or Hannah tonight. I'm not sure Molly has ever been so turned on. She couldn't help but realize that I was joking, but instead of a grin or a retaliatory barb, I got a cold look. "Scott, this is not funny. How could you think that I would ever do something like that? Do you really think I'll ever share you with my sisters?" When she glared at me, I felt the temperature in the room drop by about 10 degrees. "Molly, I'm sorry," I said. "I was just joking, honey." I reached out to hug her, but she pulled away from me and stood up. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, still clearly angry at me, and disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the lock click behind her. For the rest of the night and most of the next day, I was ignored. Molly seems to have decided to make it clear that some things are not to be trifled with. Finally, at dinner on Sunday, I apologized again, repeating that it was just a harmless joke, and she seemed to relax a little. That evening, she let me nestle behind her in bed, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't like it when Molly was mad at me, and I made a mental note never to joke about swapping sisters again, although it seemed funny that she was so overreacting to it. On our first date, she told me a story about how she took Amy's place on a date with a high school student. And I remembered a case a few weeks before our wedding when this topic came up again. Molly and I disagreed over some trivial matter, like which hotel we should stay at for our honeymoon in Curacao. Of course, I gave in to her, but during our joking argument, I suggested that if she didn't want me, then maybe I would marry one of her sisters. Then she joked back at me, "I don't think they'll take you, baby. Both Amy and Hannah sleep very soundly, and I told them that you snore sometimes. This will be an obstacle to the deal. You'd better stay with me." "Rats," I replied. "Okay, if I can't have Amy or Hannah, then I guess I'll marry you after all." And that was the end of it. So I didn't understand at all why, a few years later, she got so angry when I made the same joke. In any case, as I said before, it was the birth of a child, or rather our attempt to have a child, that turned my life upside down. We tried, and enjoyed it. About 10 months. I've heard of many couples who took a year or two to get pregnant, so I wasn't worried at all. But Molly became increasingly concerned about the lack of success, and she insisted that I go to our doctor and get checked out. That's what I did. I had fun sitting in a small room with magazines, and then I waited for a phone call a few days later. It came on Friday when I was at work. I closed the door of my office and talked to Dr. Rendell for a couple of minutes. "Well, Scott, you don't have to worry," he said. "The amount of fluid is slightly below normal. It is about 70% of the average for men aged 30 years, but there is nothing wrong with that. Your fluid is healthy and strong. There just aren't that many of them. You and Molly shouldn't have any problems conceiving, but it may take a little longer than some couples." That was good news, and I was looking forward to going home and reassuring Molly. But for some reason, it slipped my mind. At dinner, we had a long conversation about the politics of the city of Cincinnati, and I forgot about it. The topic came back to me only by almost 23 o'clock. That evening, the usual gatherings of the sisters took place in our kitchen. I watched basketball on TV and then went to bed. I often fell asleep before Molly got up. But when I was almost dozing off, I remembered the news about the amount of my fluid, and I felt I had to tell Molly immediately. So I grabbed my robe and headed downstairs, deciding that I would interrupt the conversation in the kitchen long enough to tell Molly that we had nothing to worry about. Passing through the living room towards the kitchen, I heard a burst of boisterous laughter from 3 sisters through the closed swing door. I smiled to myself, thinking for the 100th time how much they enjoyed each other's company, and instead of heading straight to the kitchen, I stopped for a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. It was completely innocent, I swear. I just couldn't help but wonder what they were talking about so merrily. I had no idea what I was about to hear. Voice #1. "Well, if he's not the best, why do you always want to switch with me?" Voice #2, giggling. "I didn't say Arnie wasn't the best." Voice no. 3, or is it still no? 2, I can't tell you. "Besides, you greedy cow, you still get Arnie more nights every week than any of us." "Plus the weekend," another voice interrupted. "So you probably shouldn't complain about your situation." More laughter. I stood there in complete shock. To say I couldn't believe what I heard is to understate. I couldn't believe it. Change? Making love to each other's husbands? I quietly sat down on a chair, trying to come to my senses, and tuned into the conversation again. Almost a year, and I just don't think Scott will be able to do the job. It must be Molly, I thought. "So you have a plan B?" "Yes, if his tests don't come back to normal. He passed the tests about a week ago, so we should find out at any moment." "How are we going to do this?" "No problem. I'll just spend a few nights with Ted when I'm most fertile. Anyway, it's a little boring just being with Scott every night. And at the end of the cycle, when I'm safe, I want to spend a couple of nights with Arnie." "By no means, Moll, it's not foolproof. You're not getting Arnie again until you get knocked up." Laughter. It was still too early for my shock to turn into anger. I tried my best not to believe the only conclusion I could draw from what I heard. Molly intended to let Ted get pregnant by him. I realized that Ted and I were very similar, even though he was 4 inches taller. We had the same hair and eye color, as well as a common body type, unlike Arnie, who was shorter and heavier. I sat motionless, terrified, on a chair in a dark living room, reliving the sudden end of my happy marriage. I could barely think, and then it dawned on me that the coffee clutch in the kitchen was disintegrating. I quietly retreated to the bedroom, where I jumped back into bed and lay motionless. As stunned as I was, I knew I could never stand up to Molly without thinking first. Anyway, who knew which sister would come to sleep with me? So I calmed my breathing, and when a few minutes later, one of the girls slipped into bed, she decided that I was already asleep. I felt a gentle kiss on my cheek, and her soft voice said, "I love you, baby," as Molly often did before going to bed. It was all I could do not to jump up and scream at her. "Oh, are you a cheater? Then how do you explain that you made love to my 2 brothers-in-law?" But I lay still, controlling my breathing. I waited for her to fall asleep, planning. After a few minutes, I heard Molly's breathing, or whoever it was, become slow and regular. But I waited for an hour to be absolutely sure that she was asleep before getting out of bed. I thought about how they could pull it off, and immediately realized that it wouldn't be difficult at all. If they changed husbands just for love, they would change clothes during evening meetings. They all worked part-time as co-heads of the interior design store, so none of them left the house in the morning before Arnie, Ted, and me. Changing clothes in the morning would be easy. The only difficulty could be the days off. Either we slept with our own wives on weekends, I thought, or they made arrangements to switch to another day. But it would still be possible since the six of us, almost every weekend, had a barbecue, brunch, or some kind of party. And if not, then a quick trip to my sister to pick up the catalog that she had prepared for me, or under some other pretext. No, it wasn't difficult to figure out how. I was puzzled by the why. You might think that we husbands should have caught the difference. I mean, can't you tell your own wife from another woman, for God's sake? But here's the thing. We had no reason to be suspicious. We had no doubts, or at least I had no doubts before, about the identity of the woman in my bed. And there was something else I realized. At the beginning of our marriage, Molly and I loved to lie in bed at night and just talk, either before or after, or instead of love. We talked about our relationships, our plans for the future, our jobs, our families, everything in the world. But everything has changed. I don't know when exactly, but a few years earlier, Molly had started to discourage late-night conversations. She would come into the bedroom after a sit-down with her sisters, and we would just go to bed. We could make love or not, but any conversations I tried to start were met with words. "I'm very tired, honey. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" In fact, for many years, all our important conversations, everything we said about our days or plans for the future, took place during dinner or earlier in the evening, never late at night in bed. It was probably a deliberate strategy. Since women switched partners, the fewer conversations there were, the less likely it was that a wife might be caught not knowing something she should, or not remembering something from the past. When I was sure that Molly was asleep, I sneaked into the office, found the ink pad that we used to stamp our checking accounts, and dropped some indelible black ink on the tip of my finger. Then, returning to the bedroom, I carefully made a small mark on her back, on the right side, about halfway between her shoulder blade and shoulder. It was no bigger than a pencil eraser, and she would never have noticed it if she hadn't been looking at her back in the mirror. I went to the bathroom and washed my finger with warm water and soap. As I expected, the ink remained. Even a strong wash removed only part of it. I treated my finger with pumice stone for some time, until what was left became so dim that no one could notice it. Climbing back into bed, I smiled grimly to myself as I considered my next steps. The worst of the shock had passed, and I was deeply angry. If what I understood from the women's conversation was accurate, Molly betrayed me, carefully and systematically, perhaps for many years. She and her sisters put themselves and their common bond above the duty to love and be faithful, which they all had to fulfill in front of their husbands. I felt used, cheated, humiliated. I tried to imagine how all this could be fixed, but I didn't see any way. On Saturday afternoon, we had a barbecue at Ted's house. I was waiting for the moment when the women were inside, presumably cooking. Ted was busy with the grill, and I asked Arnie if he wanted to walk around the block. He was always a little worried about his weight, so he was happy to exercise a little. When we got to a safe distance from the house, I said, "Arnie, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about something personal for a few minutes. Do you mind?" "Of course, Scott, what's the matter?" "Well, first of all, let's agree that this will be just between us, okay? I don't want Molly or Hannah or Amy and Ted, for that matter, to know that we had this conversation. So if anyone asks what we talked about during the walk, let's just say that I asked you about a trip next summer, got your ideas about whether we could go to Greece." Arnie seemed pleased with this disguise. He chuckled and said, "My lips will be sealed. I'm a little embarrassed, but I wanted to ask about your beautiful life with Hannah. Molly and I make love about once or twice a week, and I often wish it was more often. I'm just wondering if her sisters have the same thing." Arnie slapped me heartily on the back with his hand and said with a laugh, "I'm afraid you've got the short end of the stick, buddy. Hannah and I do this every night, practically every night. I think sometimes we miss the night when she has her period, or one of us is very tired, but otherwise everything is regular as clockwork." He saw the expression on my face and grinned. "You chose the wrong sister, didn't you? Well, how could you know? Or any of us, for that matter. I think I was just lucky." Keeping a disappointed expression on my face to hide the rage I felt, I said, "I think so, Arnie. Tell me, has it always been like this? I mean, since the beginning of your marriage?" He thought about it. "Almost always. Hannah and I have such a routine, I think you could call it a little game that we play. Do you know how girls gather in someone's kitchen in the evenings? I nodded, and he continued. By the time she gets back, I'm usually in bed, reading or watching TV. And when she comes into the bedroom, she looks at me with such an expression on her face and always says the same thing in a sweet voice. Well, big boy, how do you want me tonight? And I suggest something, a cowboy pose or maybe warming up with a back scrub. And then we do it. Or sometimes she comes in and says, hey, big boy, how about a doggy? But almost always it's the same phrase. How do you want me tonight? I know it sounds stupid, but as long as I'm being used, I'm not complaining. He laughed heartily, and I tried to join him. One more question, I said. Molly and I used to talk a lot in bed, about ourselves, about our relationship and the like. But in recent years, the bedroom has become practically just for love and sleep. We don't talk anymore. Is Hannah like that too? To a large extent. We seem to reserve these meaningful conversations about relationships for another time of day. It doesn't really matter to me, I have to say. But I think it's almost like you and Molly. He laughed a little. A bedroom for love and then for falling asleep. As we walked back to the house, Arnie chatted, mostly about the Cincinnati Bengals, his only big love besides Hannah. And I tried to say yes, I know, and really, at the right moments. But my thoughts were far away, in some very cold, dark, deserted place. And he was very, very angry. I managed to hold out all day and evening without breaking down, although people noticed that I was a little withdrawn. I was determined to hold out for another day, so after we left Ted and Amy, I invited Molly to Indian food, her favorite, and tried to be a cheerful companion all evening. Around 22:00, Molly, as usual, spent some time with Amy and her sisters, and when she returned and we were getting ready for bed, I approached her from behind, gently stroked her neck and shoulders, and looked for an ink trail. He wasn't there. Well, that's it, I thought. You're a fucking cheater. Whoever you are, it's time for you and your sisters to feel the heat. Honey, I said, how's that scratch on your leg? Let me take a look. Whichever sister it was, she was a little tense. A scratch? What is it? She asked cautiously. Yes, yesterday after dinner when you hit the dishwasher door, I said, bending down to look at her feet. Oh, that, she said, a little too casually. It's all right. There's not even a trace left. Yes, you're right, I replied, looking closer. I don't see any tracks, that's great. Back then it really looked disgusting. I straightened up and saw her practically breathe a sigh of relief. I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth, grinning to myself. There was no scratch, and her reaction only confirmed that whatever sister was in my bedroom today, it wasn't the one who was there the day before. A few minutes later, I was lying in bed waiting for her when she came out of the bathroom. Hey, honey, I said. Let's end tonight the way we ended yesterday. It was amazing. What do you mean, honey? She replied, looking more than a little wary. Don't you remember? You came from downstairs with a twinkle in your eyes and said something like, well, big boy, how do you want me tonight? It was so hot. And I said, gee, a nice one would probably be nice. And then you pushed me back on the bed and teased me until I went crazy. And then you climbed on top of me and rode me like a wild woman. God, it was fantastic. Don't you remember that? For a moment, Molly looked completely stunned. Then a pained expression appeared on her face, and I saw that she was thinking fast. Of course I remember, honey. I'm just not sure that tonight I'm ready for something so energetic again. Okay, I said. Let's be slow and gentle instead if you want. But tell me the things you said to me last night, okay? She slid into bed and immediately hugged me, pulling me to her so that I couldn't see her face. Of course, baby, she murmured. I'll say whatever you want. I just like to excite you. What things did you particularly like? I chuckled to myself. You're not getting off the hook that easily. Oh, you know everything. What you said while we were doing it. She was silent while we stroked and caressed each other. I was instantly aroused, despite the fact that I was angry, but surprise, surprise, Molly seemed to have a harder time getting in the right mood. My usual stroking, licking her breasts, and so on, did not excite her at all. I pulled back to look at her. Is everything all right, honey? I asked innocently. It seems that you are not quite with me today. Catching my gaze, she replied, I'm sorry, Scott. I guess I'm just a little tired and my stomach is bothering me, probably because of the spicy food. Let's make love. but please don't expect me to be wild and crazy again today, okay? I smiled lovingly and said, Of course, Molly. Let's do it in a missionary way, gently and tenderly. We can save all your hot words for another night. She kissed me with relief, and I climbed on top of her as she spread her legs. This was followed by a completely ordinarily pleasant love of married people, just like it was on countless previous occasions with my wife Molly. At least I always thought it was my wife Molly. Sunday was the day when everything went awry. All three couples had a brunch planned downtown at Trentino, a place we all liked, and then we went back to Arnie and Hannah. The men watched the Bengals game, and the sisters chatted and laughed together all day, happy beyond belief. I had Molly in my sights all morning, making sure she didn't call any of her sisters in advance. I realized that she was very angry, thinking that my Friday night bed partner, whoever it was, had not properly informed her about the scratch on her leg or about the wild love with me, neither of which of course happened. When we all sat down in the Trentino restaurant and the waiter took the order for drinks, less than 10 seconds had passed when Molly looked significantly at one of her sisters and said, Hannah, I need to powder my nose. Could you keep me company? And they left, Molly with an angry and gloomy look, Hannah with a slight bewilderment. It took several minutes before they returned. This time they looked the same, pale and worried. They were fiddling with their drinks and constantly losing the thread of the conversation. Both of them tried their best not to look at me, but I saw intense glances whenever it seemed like I wasn't looking at them. As I suspected, Molly must have blamed Hannah for not telling her what we had done the previous night. Hannah told her that there were no such things, and they both started to worry, very worried. Only Amy seemed unaffected at first, chatting cheerfully with her sisters and with us. But after a few minutes, she caught the mood. She didn't know what was the matter, but it was quite clear that something was wrong. When we had finished our eggs Benedicta, salmon omelet, and Belgian waffles, she said, Hannah, with elaborate ease, Honey, one of my contacts is really bothering me. Could you go take a look? And when they returned a few minutes later, 3 pale and tense sisters were sitting at the table. None of them looked at me or took part in our conversation. Their nervousness and suffering persisted all day, much to my delight. While Ted, Arnie, and I enjoyed watching the Bengals win one game for a change, against the Browns, who were even more unlucky than the home team this year, the girls hid at the far end of the house. We didn't hear a word from them for 3 hours, and when it was time to leave, none of my daughters-in-law could look me in the eye when we hugged goodbye. And dinner at our house was held in silence, although I reveled in creating a cheerful facade by telling Molly funny stories about colleagues at work, or about our vacation plans in the coming year. She barely managed to smile or respond in monosyllabic phrases at the right moments. I could tell she was terrified. All evening, while we were cleaning the kitchen and watching TV, I pretended that everything was fine, and I watched Molly with fear and horror in her eyes. Around 21:15, she said, Honey, I'm going to Hannah's for a while, okay? Of course, baby. While you're gone, I'll probably pack my things and put them in the car. Of course, I'll need a truck for furniture and stuff, so I'll do it later in the week. The color disappeared from her face. Scott, about what? What are you talking about? Why do you need to pack your things? I answered casually. Because I'm leaving, of course. You don't think I'm going to keep living in a house with a lying, cheating cheater, do you? She gasped and stared at me. Honey, I don't understand that. I just looked at her, and her words stopped. Of course she understood, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. I'll see you when you get back, I said and turned toward the stairs. No, Scott, wait, she screamed, her voice trembling, but I ignored her and went to pack my things. I thought her first step would be to call her sisters, and I was right. No more than 3 minutes later, Molly appeared in the bedroom doorway and said, Honey, Amy and Hannah are here. Could you come down and talk to us? She looked terrible. Her cheeks were stained with tears and her makeup was running. She looked very scared and unhappy, and for a moment, just for a moment, I even felt sorry for her. Yes, I replied, turning away. I'll be down in a minute. I quickly looked into the room for a digital voice recorder, a small one the size of a cigarette pack, which I sometimes used to dictate notes in the car. I set it to record and put it in my pocket. When I arrived in the kitchen, 3 women were already sitting at the table, looking tense and unhappy. I sat down, looked from one to the other, and asked, So? There was a long silence. None of them wanted to start. Finally, Molly said, Scott, you know how much I love you, right? I'm sorry, I said coldly, but which of the sisters are you? I'm Molly, she screamed. Your wife. Oh, really? Please wait a minute. I walked around behind her and examined her back. No black spots. I checked the other two sisters, and one of them had it on. They looked at me with incomprehension. I sat down again. All right, I said. As an argument, let's say you're Molly. Then where did you sleep on Friday night when your sister was here? And I pointed to the one with the mark on her back. Lying in bed with me. They all stared at me. Take your time, I said. I'm not in a hurry. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why at least 2, if not 3 of you have spent the night in my bed over the past 3 nights. There was a long silence. Molly started crying and the other 2 just stared gloomily. I pretended like I wanted to get up. I need to pack my things, I said. No, wait, she said Molly quickly. I'll explain. Only, just please, Scott, please give me a chance to make you understand. I wanted to shout at her that it was too late to explain, but I realized that I really wanted to hear what she would say, what a perverse justification the 3 of them could offer for what they were doing. And for that matter, will they tell me the truth? I waited, but Molly was crying too hard to speak. Instead, one of her sisters began. It's just a stupid game, Scott. It started as a joke, and I do not know, she began to live her own life. And you? Hannah. Look, it was just a tease, a joke, you know. About a month ago. We joked about each other's husbands, you know, what we like about you, what's not so much, and we started talking about love. And somehow we had an idea, to try each of you, you know, switch. It probably sounds like a pretty bad idea right now, but we were just teasing each other, challenging each other like, you're too cowardly to do this, and then, well, after a couple of weeks, things got more serious. Molly and Amy were watching Hannah. She continued. Anyway, that's what happened on Friday night. We changed clothes when we met here in the kitchen and went to each other's house. Amy was with you, I was with Ted, and Molly was with Arnie. Then on Saturday, we swapped for a barbecue again. It was stupid, Scott. We all understand that now. And you must be very angry, but please give Molly a chance to make amends. She loves you so much. Just look at how unhappy she is. She pointed at her sister, who was crying incessantly. So, I said, Amy was with me and Molly was with Arnie? They all nodded. I turned to Amy. So how was it, Amy? How is love with me compared to love with good old Ted? Amy looked stunned. I don't know, Scott. It was great, actually. Yes? Is it great? Please refresh my memory. How did we do it? What exactly happened? Amy couldn't meet my gaze. I don't actually remember. It was just 2 nights ago, for the first time in your married life, you swapped husbands with one of your sisters and you can't remember what we did. Do you have early-stage Alzheimer's disease or something? I turned back to Hannah. Nice try, Hannah, but your story is complete nonsense. Yes, it was Amy in my bed on Friday night because I put a black ink mark on her back after she fell asleep and she's still there. But we didn't have love at all. And I wouldn't want you to try to insult my intelligence on top of everything else that you 3 fools have done, trying to lie to me that this was the first time. Do you think I do not know that you 3 have recognized Arnie as the best person? They choked, but I ignored them and continued. Do you think I do not know that one of you 3 uses it 7 nights a week and me less than twice a week? But I'm getting a consolation prize, aren't I? I stopped to see how they would take it. Molly was sobbing almost hysterically, and her sisters just looked grim. My patience was running out, but I wanted them to admit the truth. You have one more try, I said. Another attempt to tell me the truth. And this time I want to hear it from Molly. How long have you been making love to each of their husbands? She looked at me, red-eyed, pleading, and I waited. The room was silent. Finally, she turned away from me and looked at the table. For many years, since Hannah and Arnie's wedding. Silence again. I was waiting. Hannah spoke up. It wasn't her fault, Scott. Amy and I insisted. But it was only from time to time, Scott, Molly insisted. For example, a couple of times a year. Okay, I said. So what's next? No one wanted to answer me. So it gradually became more frequent? Yes, Amy said reluctantly. So the 3 of you regularly shared 3 husbands among yourselves, as in a small round dance. Is that so, Molly? She nodded plaintively. And when did it turn into 7 nights a week with Arnie and casual love for me? She didn't answer me or look at me. How many of the 7 nights did Arnie spend with you every week, Molly? 1 or 2, she murmured. That's just great, I said. I had already heard everything I could stand, and there was no reason to listen anymore. It was simple. Just love, honey, she said, looking at me pleadingly. It had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how I love you, how we love each other. Oh? And nothing to do with pregnancy either, I suppose. She was panting, and her sisters looked worried. Scott, what are you... Do you think I do not know, my dear devoted wife, that you were going to get pregnant by Ted because you did not think that I would be able to cope with this task? She gasped. No, Scott. And she got up and walked around the table to hug me. I stood up and pushed her away from me, and she tripped over the refrigerator. You fool, don't ever touch me again. You betrayed me in almost every way you can betray a husband with the help of your 2 cheating sisters. Now the 3 of you can share Arnie and Ted, unless you decide to add a new guy to your stable when you need to eat your cunts. And before they could answer, I dashed through the swing door and out of the kitchen. I grabbed my suitcase and went out the front door. I didn't see them anymore, although I heard crying in the kitchen. I spent an angry, sleepless night in a Hyatt hotel room, and in the morning I took time off from work and went to a lawyer, then to the bank. And I made an appointment to meet Arnie and Ted for lunch. I did it so urgently that Ted canceled the scheduled meeting. We sat in a booth at the diner and ordered sandwiches, after which I didn't waste any time. Guys, I don't know if you'll believe this, but our wives cheated on us. More precisely, they moved into bed with the 3 of us. It seems to have been going on for several years. Arnie was completely shocked, but to my surprise, Ted just nodded and said, I guessed that something like this was happening. I didn't want to believe it, but we both stared at him. What made you suspect? I said. There were just too many times when Amy forgot something, when she didn't remember a conversation that took place earlier in the day or the night before. Of course, I wasn't sure, and I wasn't going to accuse until I had solid evidence, so I kept records of what she had forgotten. I've decided that when I have something more convincing, I'll talk to you 2. Anyway, how did you know? He asked. I told them about the conversation I had overheard and then about the ink mark trick. Ted looked thoughtful, and Arnie kept repeating, Incredible, just incredible. When I finished, he said, Are you sure, Scott? I mean, it's so crazy. I said, Here's a recording of the conversation I had with the 3 of them last night, and played the tape without further comment. When it was over, we looked at each other gloomily, and then began to talk seriously. Both Arnie and Ted called their offices and said they wouldn't be there that day. I said I was divorcing Molly. There was no turning back. They didn't know what they were going to do yet. We talked for a couple of hours, and I realized that, ironically, I had never felt closer to my 2 brothers-in-law. They were both great guys, and I will miss them. I found an apartment that I liked, returned with a truck, took a few pieces of our furniture, and moved into it. By the end of the week, I took the rest of my clothes and belongings out of the house. Molly repeatedly called me at work and on my cell phone. I told the assistant to reject her calls and arranged for a new mobile number. Keeping my apartment's phone number on an unregistered list also turned out to be a good idea. I filed for divorce and began to make plans for the rest of my life. On Thursday, I had a very strange conversation with Barbara, one of my friends from work. Probably everyone in the office saw that I was distracted and angry, but she still asked me about it. I practically told her the whole story, and her face showed a mixture of surprise, sympathy, and some kind of perverted pleasure. It made me angry, and I told her that. I'm so sorry, Scott, she said. Of course, I'm not happy about what they did to you. It's simple. She looked a little embarrassed. It's simple. Well, I've always had the idea that you and I could, to become a good couple. I stared at her. Barbara was not only a good person, generous and cheerful, she was also tall and very beautiful. I was always vaguely aware of how attractive she was, but I was so in love with Molly that I didn't even think about it. Now, suddenly, it seemed like it was worth thinking about. We talked a little more with her. We kept it a secret, but Barbara saw that I was thinking about her in a completely new way. Through my lawyer, Molly begged and asked for a meeting with me, for an opportunity to explain everything. I was sure she wouldn't be able to tell me anything that could make a difference, but I met her anyway, and I was right. We were in my lawyer's conference room, alone, about 6 weeks after I moved in. I was sitting and waiting when she came in, Sad, but still very beautiful. I waited for her to sit down. So, Molly, I said, how are you? Have you gotten pregnant with Ted yet? She blushed. No, Scott, I'm not in love with Ted or anyone, and I'm not going to get pregnant by anyone but you. You know, I said, that night when I overheard you in the kitchen, I was just about to tell you that Dr. Randall said my fluid was fine. A little low, but strong enough to make babies. There would be no need to rely on Ted's help. On the other hand, you made love to him and Arnie regularly anyway, so I don't think there's much difference. She was already close to tears. Please, Scott, let me explain everything. Can you let me tell you how sorry I am? How terrible I feel? Do you think you feel worse than I do, Molly? She looked at me sadly and shook her head. All right, I said with a sigh. Go on. But do me a favor and don't tell me how much you love me. Don't tell me that what you did has nothing to do with you and me. Just don't, okay? But Scott, it had nothing to do with you and me. It was, I don't know, just a crazy thing that Hannah, Amy, and I did. We've always done this since high school. Our little game is not meant to hurt anyone. Have you done this with all your boyfriends? With almost everyone we've met for at least a long time. My sisters and I have always been so close, and I think that, I don't know, made us closer. We shared everything, clothes, gossip, friends, even boyfriends. I sat quietly and let her continue. What the hell, I was learning something. When you and I got married, I thought it would stop, and it has been for several years. Wait a minute, I said. Did your sisters use me while we were dating? She blushed. Yes, 2 or 3 times. I didn't really want to, especially when things got serious between us, but in the past we always shared, and they were very persistent. Well, I said sarcastically, I guess I passed the test because you didn't leave me. She didn't say anything. Molly, you just don't get it, do you? You played me like a fool just so you and your sisters could have fun. You've been making love to Arnie instead of me for years, because he was better in bed than I was. Have you even thought about how I feel about this? What the hell is so good about him? No, wait, don't answer. I don't want to hear it. Her lips were trembling. Scott, I know it happened. Awful. But you should have made love to all 3 of us. But I didn't know that. You dumbass, haven't you figured it out yet? Even if we were talking about switching places, which I would never agree to, but it doesn't matter. If we decided to do it, I would get pleasure and excitement from making love with other women. But I didn't know it wasn't you, Molly. For me, it was always you. Not someone new and exciting. Just the woman I loved more than anything in the world. I was getting more and more annoyed. How could she understand so little of what she and her sisters had done? Look, I said, it's simple. I was your husband. You should have put me above everyone else. Our relationship should have been above your relationship with anyone else. But this did not happen. You put Hannah and Amy above me. You put Arnie above me. You were going to get pregnant by Ted without telling me a word, for God's sake. And now, you can have them. But you won't have me. I really had enough. I got up to leave the room. Sobbing, she said, but baby, I don't want them. I don't need my sisters. I need you. Well, I said, isn't that nice? After all these years, you decided to choose me over your sisters. But now it's not you who chooses, it's me. And I choose to be without the woman who lied to me and cheated on me, who made a complete fool of me for years. Have a happy life. She buried her face in her hands, crying loudly, but made no attempt to stop me as I headed for the exit. After this conversation, it suddenly seemed to me that life would be easier to move on. Barbara and I started dating, and after the 3rd date, I discovered that there are other women in the world, besides Molly, or her sisters, with whom I can enjoy making love. Barbara was energetic and grateful, and our first night in her bed turned into a whole weekend. It was hot, it was fun, but whether it would lead to something serious, I had no idea. But it sure as hell made me feel better. We still meet and often make love, but we are in no hurry. Barbara is smart enough to understand how messed up I am right now, and she doesn't put any pressure on me, which I really appreciate. Arnie decided not to kick Hannah out. Not so surprising, I think. After all, he was the girl's first choice in bed, and the revelations about what they were doing weren't as devastating to him as they were to Ted and me. But he forced Hannah to grow her hair long so that she could never switch with her sisters again, without his knowledge. He told her that if she ever made fun of him again, with me, Ted, or anyone else, she would be penniless. And he said he didn't mind using Amy or Molly from time to time, but whenever he wanted, not according to their schedule. Arnie told me that Hannah looked pretty pissed when he said that, but she kept her mouth shut. She knows she's on very thin ice right now, he told me with a grin. Ted found a way to hurt Amy the most, even though he didn't do it intentionally. He found a really good job in Chicago and told Amy he would move there in 3 weeks. You can move there with me, and we'll find a counselor and try to fix our marriage, he told her. Or you can stay in Cincinnati with your sisters. Choose one. Now Amy is in agony. She can't let Ted go, but she also can't live without talking to her sisters. Damn bad, if you ask me. Use her, use all 3 of them.